Alright, it is time to rank another soundtrack. And for this edition, I'm going to be doing Rockin Kats on the NES. As usual, I'm just doing the stage themes, but this one was a little complicated to figure out just because there are segments to each stage and the music breaks off into something else some of the time, and there are some repeats. So what I decided to do was, for the named stages, the ones that you select on the TV at the beginning, those stages are named, and the first song you hear for the first part of each of those stages, that's what I decided to call that particular piece of music when you hear that for the first time in that section. And then when there are others that are heard in other segments of a stage, I just named it based off of the surroundings. So there's like the song that you hear in the subway chase and the song that you hear in the minecart. So for those, I just named based off of where you would find that stage. There's no official name for it or anything like that. As always, I will preface this list with the fact that these songs are, or this listing is just my opinion, how they're ranked. There's no definitiveness behind any of it. It's just my thoughts. And you can share your thoughts too, what you agree with or disagree with, and what you think of the soundtrack altogether. And we can agree to disagree. I encourage discussion and debate. So without any further ado, let's get on with the list. Number 9, Western Adventure. This song is just crap. It's just some 7th-rate, cheap imitation of the theme from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And speaking of ugly, the way that that whistle decays is ugly as fuck. It's, this out-of-tune note at the end of it, it's just so tuneless at the end, it's gross. And it's a lazy-ass way to make a Western theme. Why not do something original out of it? You can still make it sound Western-y. This is so hackneyed, and, I mean, take Mappyland, for example. That's a soundtrack also that I just recently ranked. It did that. It made a Western-level song that sounded fitting for a Western level, and it was one of the better songs in the game. I'm sure that it borrowed elements from another Western song or something like that, but it wasn't like this blatant ripoff, and a really horrible ripoff too. Thankfully, you don't hear this song for very long. Number 8, The Graveyard / Cave / Another Cave. You hear this song 3 times. It's a cool riff, it's dark and brooding, but it's the same 2-note pattern back and forth over and over and over again. The loop lasts less than a second. Actually, I lie. The bass actually does these 2 different progressions, but it's all in all one note that's held for a duration of each measure. It's otherwise the same thing. And that, coupled with the lead riff doing literally the same thing over and over again, that's what makes it very repetitive. And it's unfortunate because this could have been a really cool intro to a song if they decided to give it more sections. So I like it for what it is, but it's not complete and it gets repetitive quickly. Number 7, The Subway / Minecart. This was just upbeat rock and roll, but like the Graveyard song, it's repetitive. It works for the segments that they're using them for, the whole chase on a vehicle thing, especially since they're both fairly brief, so it makes the song short by default, and you don't have to hear it for as long, but there's not a lot to it. Number 6, I Love New York. This one has a cool rhythm section. The drums and bass have a really nice groove going, but the lead is just a stab at the root of every other measure. This would be fine if it were leading to something else, but like many of the songs on the soundtrack, it's underwritten. It really just sounds like a build-up to something that never comes. The only thing different that happens throughout the whole song is this little turnaround, which is pretty underwhelming too. Number 5, Sky Ace. There's a nice contrast between the pulsing bass and the longer sustained notes of the lead. I like when songs have that dynamic going on, but then the lead gets crazy busy in the refrain. And something else that I didn't even notice until I really listened to the song is that the second time you hear the verse, it's actually a different variation. it's not exactly the same. It's quite subtle. So there's a little bit more involved in this song than the ones that were preceding it on the list. And it has some cool dynamics. Number 4, Zeppelin. The creepy tone of this and deliberate pace gives Zeppelin an unsettling vibe. It's pretty cool. It reminds me of the Friday the 13th Cabin song, but it's not quite as good as that one. Similar to it, the notes descend, but then go back to the beginning of the progression a little bit quicker. And unfortunately, there aren't any other segments aside from the weird intro, which isn't really weird, it's just that it's a little off-putting and abrupt, which is something I like. I like unpredictability. It's just too bad there wasn't a little bit more of that, I guess. Number 3, Playland. The verse is a pretty typical, almost forced, stereotypical carnival waltz type of song. Not nearly as trite as Western Adventure at all, but still in that realm. But then the refrain comes in, and it gives us something a little more fresh. It stays within the theme of the adventure carnival stuff I was mentioning earlier, but it's not nearly as tropey and obvious as the verse. It basically justifies it, because I like the contrast between the longer sustained notes in the verse versus the busier refrain, and it's overall just catchy. Number 2, the final stage. It has a groovy drum beat, and the bass and lead are mostly playing the same thing, but it's got one of those pulsating riffs that chugs like a locomotive and gets you to bob your head. It's another short loop. It's the same riff with 2 different root notes, but it's got a kick-ass tone. It's groovy as hell, and I do like the part where it changes to the other half of the progression. It really saves the song, because as repetitive as it is, it would be flat out jarring without that little lick. And number 1, Downtown Street. This is by far the most complete song on the soundtrack. There are only 2 sections, a verse and a refrain, but there's a lot more going on than the other songs. The verse has several variations of the main riff, and the refrain does too, but it also has some nice layering with 2 tracks of lead playing at the same time. It's probably got the catchiest hook on the soundtrack too. It's quite the earworm. So that'll do it for this soundtrack. Here's a quick recap. Number 9, Western Adventure. Number 8, Graveyard. Number 7, Subway. Number 6, I Love New York. Number 5, Sky Ace. Number 4, Zeppelin. Number 3, Playland. Number 2, The Final Stage. And number 1, Downtown Street. So that's it for this list. That's it for this game's soundtrack. What are your thoughts on the soundtrack? How does your list compare to mine? Etc., etc. Feel free to leave your comments in the comments. Until then, see you next time.